Our economic response will allow those Australians who are in financial stress as a result of the coronavirus to access more of their own money in superannuation, and is estimated to put up to $27 billion of superannuation back into the pockets of hard-working Australians.
It was the federal coalition's moves to free up access to superannuation during the pandemic that first sent a chill through the superannuation industry. However much it may have helped people in financial stress, setting such a precedent for releasing money that is supposed to be used to fund retirement raised alarming questions for the industry.
We want to further help Australians get past what is the biggest hurdle on their path to home ownership.
And then there was this move in the dying days of last year's election campaign. The coalition made a last-ditch bid for votes by pledging access to super for housing. The alarm bells in the super industry rang even louder.
When the Morrison government allowed people to withdraw up to $20,000 from their accounts during the COVID pandemic, nearly $40 billion of cash came out of the superannuation system. And what that means is that the trustees then have got to be thinking, I can't invest in that toll road, or I can't invest in this asset for the long term, in a new office block. I've got to have more in cash available, for which, of course, they earn a lower return. And so allowing the early release of superannuation money means that overall, for everyone in the super fund, the long-term returns are going to be lower.
The coalition moves started a campaign by the superannuation industry to try to entrench the objective of super as being about providing retirement incomes.
Well, we certainly agree with the need to have an objective for superannuation. It is about sustainability, it's about giving confidence in the system, and it's a good idea that we all agree on the purpose of superannuation.
The coalition policies also had big implications for individuals and for the federal budget. The super industry estimates people who drew down on their super during the pandemic will be $80,000 worse off when they retire, and that as a result, it has added $70 billion to the cost of the pension. And the raids on super, actual or proposed, lie behind Treasurer Jim Chalmers' announcement last week that the government wants to legislate an objective of super. That is, to assert in the law the reason why superannuation exists, to fund people's retirement, and why it can't be raided whenever a government gets into economic or political trouble.
This will be a defining decade for our country, and that demands, I think, a defining role for superannuation.
For any government policy, you do need to have a defined purpose. You need it to set the direction of policy, you need it to be an anchor for policy.
Former senior Treasury official and staffer to Peter Costello, Mike Callaghan, reviewed the retirement income system for the Morrison government in 2020. He agrees there needs to be a legislated objective for super.
There's significant tax concessions involved. Superannuation is to support retirement incomes to supplement or replace the age pension. It's not just to accumulate wealth to pass on to your children.
Hi, Bob. Hi, Betty. From July 1, your employer will have to plant money into superannuation on your behalf.
Part of the political problem for the government is that around 70% of the workforce has started working since this ad appeared in 1992, explaining the reason for compulsory superannuation. The plan was for super to reduce people's reliance on or even replace an age pension system which was increasingly unaffordable to government and increasingly inadequate for pensioners.
There's actually a bargain that was struck between government and each worker in the economy that the money that went into your super account would be taxed at a concessional rate of 15% rather than your marginal tax rate, which for most people, of course, is much higher. So you get a tax concession for that saving in return for preserving it until you retire.
But it hasn't quite worked out that way. An assessment released by the Treasurer today shows that the cost of super tax concessions has grown to about $50 billion a year and is continuing to climb, and that more than half of tax concessions on super earnings alone go to the top 20% of income earners. That raises questions about the equity of the scheme and its financial sustainability, And that's the argument the Prime Minister and the Treasurer used today to explain why they will take a proposal to the next election to increase the tax on future earnings of super accounts with balances of more than $3 million from 15% to 30%.
This proposal does not change the fundamentals of our superannuation system. 99.5% of people with superannuation are unaffected by this reform.
Making any changes to super is always politically dangerous, particularly when you have promised not to do so.
Do you rule out any increases to super taxes and changes to caps?
We've said we have no intention of making any super changes. One of the things that we're doing in this campaign is we're making all of our policies clear.
He said he wouldn't raise taxes on Australian super. At the end of the day, Australian super is Australians' money.
That's why the changes are proposed for after the next election. The government will be seeking a mandate.
It's after the next election. It's also not retrospective. It applies to future earnings. The savings that are made from the reduction in these tax breaks will contribute $900 million to the bottom line over the forward estimates.
A lot of the really big super account balances are in self-managed funds, and the industry body that represents those funds has been arguing firmly against the sorts of caps the government has announced today.
We've already got caps in place, and we've got, we face the prospect of having caps on caps here. So it just adds to the complexity of the system. But also, what I'd put on the table as well, that this is about consumer confidence in the superannuation system. If we want individuals to save for retirement, then we've got to stop moving the goalposts.
But the big industry super funds can see merit in the idea.
If you go back a few years to a review that the Morrison government initiated into retirement incomes for those that had more than $10 million in their superannuation account, the value of the tax concessions for each of them was $160,000, and that's a bit more than the average balance of all Australian workers, just in the value of a tax concession for one multimillionaire.
It was Mike Callaghan's review that came up with those figures.
We have an income and an assets test that makes sure the pension goes to those who don't have significant financial resources, and it tapers out. So it reduces inequities in retirement. Superannuation doesn't. It promotes them, because the very nature of superannuation is your balances depend on how long you're in the workforce and how high your income is. If you project for going forward, soon the cost of superannuation tax, well, not soon, but in about 2050, the cost of superannuation tax concessions are going to cost more than the age pension.